This video is sponsored by the visual interactive learning app, Imprint. Understand things like the psychology of social dynamics with engaging courses, lessons, and summaries. Get a free 7-day trial and 20% off an annual premium membership using my link in the description. What does it mean to be respected? Is fear or love more effective? What does it mean to lead and be led? What is success and goodness in a world filled with malice and ambiguity? These questions, along with many more, were asked and attempted to be answered by one of the most revolutionary political philosophers in history, Niccolò Machiavelli. Machiavelli's work attempted to dismantle the very ideas of goodness, cruelty, leadership, and power. He is now often regarded as one of history's first true pragmatists and the father of modern political science. Regardless of any universal truth to his ideas or lack thereof, regardless of his intentions, and regardless of one's own interpretations of his work, there is much to learn from Machiavelli, both in terms of what to do and what not to do in life. Machiavelli was born in Florence, Italy in 1469. His father was a doctor of law with a largely unsuccessful practice. Likely more important to Machiavelli's story than his father's profession was his father's propensity toward reading, particularly that of Greek authors, which exposed Machiavelli to a library of books and the habit of reading. This would surely play a role in laying the groundwork for his later perceptiveness and sensibilities. Machiavelli's later philosophy can also be largely attributed to the political conditions of Florence during his lifetime. In the 15th century, the Republic of Florence was riddled with conflicts and chaos, often leading to dysfunction, insecurity, violence, and tyranny. There were coups, deceit, assassinations, and power struggles. Popes waged wars, and alliances constantly changed. Most importantly, the political and social events of Renaissance Florence displayed a clear divergence from the ideals and intentions they seemed to claim or be built on. Ideals of Christianity, like kindness and humility. How things were supposed to be always seemed to fall to the feet of how things actually were. Appearances were often facades. Religious and ethical ideals were often shields used to cover the undermining devious nature of those who held them. In early adulthood, Machiavelli experienced the government of Florence firsthand when he was impressively appointed to the Second Chancery around 1494, where he then received several position advancements and, by the age of 29, obtained the role of secretary, which put him in charge of the Republic's foreign affairs. In 1512, however, the Florentine Republic was overthrown, and a family of bankers and rulers known as the Medici family took back rule of Florence, having previously ruled for many years before losing power after a failed peace treaty with France. Once back in rule, the Medici family suspected that Machiavelli was participating in a conspiracy against them, which resulted in him being tortured and then exiled from Florence. In exile, Machiavelli would produce his two major works, The Prince and Discourses on Livy. By far, Machiavelli is most known for The Prince, which was written around 1513 and then later published in 1532. Though there are several ways one can interpret Machiavelli's intention with this work, at least in part, it was written as a gift for Lorenzo de' Medici, the Prince of Florence at the time, likely in an effort to gain his favor and employment. Broadly, The Prince reads like an instruction manual for how a prince should rule in order to be effective. Crucially, in The Prince, effectiveness blankets over all other goals and parameters. Machiavelli appears solely focused on effectiveness above everything, above goodness, above virtue, above loyalty, above honesty, and so on. Ultimately, The Prince articulates a largely amoral strategy for rulers, and it weaves a sort of web of information to be used to catch others and hold on to power with. Like how a spider might regard a fly merely as a meal, The Prince seems to suggest that a ruler ought to regard their enemies, anyone who gets in their way, or anyone who they deem must be devoured, just the same as the fly. The work is so extraordinarily dark, cynical, and pessimistic, it was banned by the Catholic Church for centuries, and one prominent cardinal by the name of Reginald Pole wrote, "I had scarcely begun to read the book when I recognized the finger of Satan. Its author is an enemy of the human race." Ironically, banning the book might itself have been resemblant of a Machiavellian tactic. Around and following Machiavelli's time, princes and rulers were generally considered good, largely based on their adherence to the moral principles of Christianity: honesty, meekness, forgiveness, loyalty, and so on. Machiavelli, however, couldn't help but notice and get hung up on where these principles were derived from: the story of Jesus Christ. a story in which a man was humiliated, rejected, arrested, tried, and crucified. From a practical human perspective, this was not a story of triumph, but a story of defeat and ineffectiveness. Most rulers, after all, don't get resurrected, literally or metaphorically. Machiavelli could see the same story of defeat and ineffectiveness unfold with leaders, merchants, and individuals in general who followed suit in such ideals. So-called good statesmen or merchants tended to lose to those who pretended to be good and then used any number of malicious tactics when they needed to in order to serve themselves. And so, rather than meekness in the name of goodness, Machiavelli believed a good, successful leader was one who maintained their power and forged a stable, secure nation, at essentially all costs and by whatever means necessary. Those who were at least willing to be immoral or amoral in their decisions and actions as leaders tended to accomplish the goals and duties of a leader more often and more powerfully, at least during this time and at least in the eyes of Machiavelli. One of the central ideas of Machiavelli's view on effectiveness was respect, and for him, respect was safest and most likely to be sustained by fear, as opposed to love or hatred. To be clear, it's not that being loved was bad in the mind of Machiavelli, but rather, in his own words, upon this a question arises, whether it be better to be loved than feared, or feared than loved. One should wish to be both, but because it is difficult to unite them in one person, it is much safer to be feared than loved. Fear, in other words, is hard for individuals to overlook and overcome, and it is easy to instill and control. Love, alternatively, is volatile, unpredictable, and hard to control. People can somewhat easily change the orientation and intensity of their love for any number of reasons. Hatred, however, is worse than both. One's appearance as a leader must always be favorable, and one's method of achieving this should be by finding the equilibrium of respect by balancing out both reward and punishment, tension and alleviation. Of course, hopefully without needing to be said at this point, taken at face value, the ideas contained in the Prince are extremely questionable. Even from a somewhat tempered, charitable view of these ideas, and putting aside Machiavelli's potential reasoning for creating his works, there are abundant criticisms of the ideas and views. Consider what Fyodor Dostoevsky observed and warned about hundreds of years later in his book Crime and Punishment, with his character Rodion Raskolnikov, who is purely rationalistic and nihilistic and uses whatever methods he can to get ahead and serve himself, but ultimately ends up being deprived and tormented by this view. Consider Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative, with which he argues that moral actions must always be based on principles that consider and serve how everyone should act and would want to live, not based on individual outcomes, circumstances, or subjective desires. And perhaps most convincingly, consider the very foundations of general morality and goodness, which suggest that in order to live in a good world, we each must act in accordance to how we would want the world to be, how we would want others to act and treat us. If we all go around clawing over each other to get to the top of the pile, there will be no pile left, and if there is, there will be nothing worthwhile to see from the top. What is power in a world of ruins? What is prosperity without the unbridled and unconcerned ability to share it healthily with others? And moreover, is not what the world becomes sometimes how we believe it ought to be? If we want a good world, both in terms of morality and prosperity, we must believe in a good world, and we must create a good world on that belief. For Machiavelli, however, if the goal is power, then perhaps these points are irrelevant. But the point is, perhaps the goal of humans isn't solely power, and if it is, perhaps it shouldn't be, at least not solely. In light defense of Machiavelli, however, perhaps this cannot be said for everyone. Some, if not many individuals, might very well be chiefly interested in power, and they might be fully willing to engage in or justify malicious tactics to obtain and sustain it. And perhaps this is where Machiavelli's work is actually most useful and practical. Another interpretation of The Prince is not as a manual for rulers, but a warning for the ruled. It is perhaps more of a portrait of humankind, painted in the style of total realism, with which one can see humanity as it really is, or can be, and can understand what to look out for, as well as how to protect oneself against it. How we live is so different from how we ought to live that he who studies what ought to be done rather than what is done will learn the way to his downfall rather than to his preservation, Machiavelli wrote. Moving somewhat beyond the realm of mere governance, we can and likely should consider a degree of Machiavelli's insights in our own individual lives. Firstly, it should be noted that, likely for Machiavelli, goodness and love are in fact ideals and are great whenever possible, but they are just simply not always possible. Being as nice as one can is great, but being dedicated to acting nicely all the time is almost certainly a performance, and almost certainly a performance that will cause more harm than good. The truth is, even the kindest and most well-intended people cannot always be nice or good, nor should they. It is not only impossible, but it is sometimes counter to the very goals of niceness and goodness. It can lead to self-neglect and self-sacrifice, which can lead to resentment or worse. It can lead to misalignment, deceit, or miscommunication, intentional or unintentional. If niceness is always the sole goal, one will have to constantly hide their true views, hopes, and desires in order to avoid upsetting or offending anyone, which inevitably leaves the truth hidden, and the truth, of course, always comes to light. Hiding it only makes it come back in worse form. Life is, at bottom, a series of messy trade-offs, including that of ethics and pleasantness. Ultimately, each of us are, in our own lives, part of the portrait of humanity. We're all participants in groups and societies, both local and broad. We each lead and are led. And we each experience varying dynamics and degrees of power, even if we have no interest in significant power or in playing the games of politics and rule. Power extends to and from everything in which we engage. To have any freedom at all is to have the power to withstand and prevent imposition. And regardless of whether humans are inherently good, bad, or neutral, we will all encounter bad people trying to impose on us, or otherwise good people trying to impose on us. Some people will inevitably screw you over, take advantage of you, ignore you, belittle you, or even hurt you if you let them. Men are so simple of mind and so much dominated by their immediate needs that a deceitful man will always find plenty who are ready to be deceived, wrote Machiavelli. And so, it is of utmost importance to not let them. Don't let them deceive you. But also, don't become them. Don't unnecessarily deceive. Every time we do not defend our own world, we open the door to dysfunction and disorder within it. But likewise, every time we do not strive to propel goodness into and forward in the world as a whole, we close the door to hope in a world worth living in. Before passing away in 1527, Machiavelli wrote several other books, including The Art of War and Florentine Histories. Following his death, his work gained increasing notoriety, and a term for the particular archetype of villain and villainous activity described by his work would be named after him, now known as Machiavellianism. But Machiavelli's thesis appears to be much less like that of villainous support and more likely to be that of the following. Apparently bad things can sometimes equate to good outcomes, and stable, effective outcomes for a nation is the utmost achievable good. Whether this is a good thesis or not is a different question. In truth, the origins and meaning of Machiavelli's work are both somewhat unknown and easy to misunderstand. Another interpretation of his work is that it was satire, merely mocking the dysfunction of principality. Regardless, what is known is that Machiavelli himself, after writing The Prince, never went on to obtain any sort of notable political success or power. Perhaps that was a matter of misfortune. Perhaps his own methods and his espousing of them in the way he did were not so effective. Or perhaps he did not mean to suggest that said methods ought to be used, and so he did not use them. Whatever the case may be, his work would nonetheless go on to inspire both real and fictional individuals. He would inspire the work of philosophers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Francis Bacon, leaders like Henry VIII, Charles V, and likely countless more, including perhaps the founding fathers of America and current world leaders. And writers like William Shakespeare, as well as most, if not all, comedic and tragic writers who've ever included a villainous archetypical character in their work. Perhaps more notably, most people's adverse reaction to at least the more villainous interpretation of Machiavelli demonstrates an innate human impulse away from such ideas and towards something better. Machiavelli's views on how the world was or is perhaps far less important than how the world can be. A man, Machiavelli wrote, who is used to acting in one way never changes. He must come to ruin when the times, in changing, no longer are in harmony with his ways. With this, perhaps Machiavelli himself would know better than to take his own ideas seriously outright in all times and places throughout history. We have, as a humanity, adapted and evolved a great deal since the conditions of the Renaissance. We are each new brushstrokes on the portrait of humanity, and it is up to each of us to try to paint a smile on the face. And it is up to each of us to decide if the smile is genuine. Understanding how to be both a good and effective person how to be both fair to others and fair to oneself, chiefly requires a respect for human psychology. One must understand the nuances of the mind, evolution, and social cohesion. An extremely effective, engaging way to do this is with the course Interpersonal Dynamics, the Psychology of Human Relationships, which you can access using this video's sponsor, Imprint, an incredible visual and interactive learning platform. The Interpersonal Dynamics course is taught by Olivia Kang, who is a neuroscientist and instructor of psychology and leadership programs at Harvard University. The courses and lessons on Imprint also use beautiful illustrations and animations, as well as gamification methods based on the science of learning to make the learning process not only enjoyable, but totally addicting in the best sense of the term. If you love Pursuit of Wonder videos, you'll surely love Imprint. In a world where content addiction is the norm, forming habits around enriching educational content that actually improves the way you think and live is what differentiates one from the masses. The course Interpersonal Dynamics is a 90-day course that covers a comprehensive array of topics, from the evolutionary origins of human social dynamics to understanding and applying insights of the mind towards strengthening and managing relationships in today's world. Other fantastic courses on Imprint include Build Leadership Skills, Communicate Effectively, Resolve Conflict, Make Smarter Decisions, and Essential Philosophy. Beyond courses, Imprint also has tons of summaries and lessons from some of today's greatest thinkers, books, and schools of thought, covering nearly every area you can think of, from science to wellness to history and much more. With over 30,000 5-star reviews on the App Store and Google Play, and winning awards like Google's App of the Year and Apple's Essential Education app, Imprint is an incredible way to turn otherwise wasted moments of mindless scrolling into powerful opportunities for knowledge and development. Use my link in the description below to sign up for Imprint, and you'll receive a 7-day free trial and 20% off your annual premium membership. And of course, as always, thank you so much for watching in general, and see you next video.